Welcome in, everyone. We finally made it. You are joining us for the season 10 finale of our forensic journey.
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're at the end of the season already.
I know, right? Over the past few months, we've walked together through, the mechanics of blunt force trauma, the timeline of postmortem intervals, the subtle science of asphyxiation, and, of course, the complexities of human identification.
Which were all fascinating.
Absolutely. But today, we are stepping into a completely different arena. We are looking at the rare, the unusual, and honestly, the profoundly deceptive. Today, we map our discussion strictly to Chapter 26 of Simpson's Forensic Medicine.
Miscellaneous poisons.
Exactly, miscellaneous poisons.
And, it feels like the only fitting way to wrap up this season. Because when forensic pathologists encounter miscellaneous poisons, they aren't dealing with your standard pharmaceutical overdoses or the common illicit drugs that flood routine toxicology screens.
Right, not the everyday stuff.
No, not at all. We are diving into industrial agents, hidden environmental hazards, botanical anomalies, chemicals that, honestly, most clinicians might only see once in a career, if that.
Wow.
Yeah. These are the agents that actively challenge forensic interpretation. They force investigators to look way beyond the obvious scene findings and dig right into the microscopic mechanisms of death.
Okay, before we get lost in the heavy metals and toxic gases, because I know we will, we need to lay down our clinical disclaimer. We bring this up every time, but it has never been more vital than it is for this specific toxicological deep dive.
Absolutely crucial today.
Right. What we are doing today is building a conceptual framework. We are designing an analytical companion to support you in reading the actual textbook. This is not a regurgitation of the text, and it is certainly not a replacement for sitting down and reading Chapter 26 of Simpson's Forensic Medicine yourself.
You really have to read it.
Yes. Whether you are a medical student gearing up for your boards, a junior doctor trying to solidify your medical legal principles on the wards, or even a senior clinician brushing up on forensic foundations, you need the textbook open alongside this analysis.
And to make the most of that reading, we have to establish a core operational rule for today. If there is one guiding principle you take away from this finale, let it be this. Mechanism defines interpretation.
Mechanism defines interpretation.
Exactly. In previous chapters, you might have gotten away with simply memorizing that a certain concentration of a drug causes a fatal overdose. That stops today.
We're throwing out the rote memorization.
We are shifting entirely away from rote memorization. You have to understand the cellular why. Does this specific poison disrupt oxygen delivery? Does it blockade cellular respiration? Does it chemically disguise itself as a vital nutrient? Because how a toxin operates at the most fundamental biochemical level dictates everything else. It dictates what happens at the scene, what you will or won't find on the autopsy table, and crucially, how you must carefully articulate your findings in court.
Okay, let's unpack this. Mechanism defines interpretation. That reframes the entire approach to a toxicology report. So let's put that rule to the test immediately by looking at an element that has fascinated toxicologists and historians for centuries: arsenic.
Ah, yes. The classic.
But we aren't starting with Victorian-era tea poisonings. We are starting with a massive forensic trap. Imagine a post-mortem tissue sample comes back positive for arsenic. The immediate reflex for a junior investigator might be to just
declare arsenic poisoner.
Right, declare arsenic poisoning and close the case. But that detection might actually mean absolutely nothing.
It is a brilliant example of why context is everything. The trap lies in the fact that arsenic naturally exists in two fundamentally different forms, organic and inorganic. And the critical dividing line between the two is their toxicity. When we use the term organic in chemistry, we just mean the arsenic atom is bound to a complex carbon-based molecule.
Like it's attached to a carbon structure.
Exactly. When arsenic is locked up in these compounds, which are known as arsenosugars or arsenobutane, it is biologically inert. It enters the human body, passes right through the system, and exits without ever exerting a single toxic effect.
To visualize this, think about oysters. If those oysters are harvested from a marine bed naturally high in arsenic, they will be full of that organic arsenic.
Right.
You could sit down, eat a massive seafood platter, and your tissue levels of arsenic would spike significantly. But you wouldn't be poisoned. You wouldn't even feel sick.
Not even a little bit. But that safety net completely vanishes when we look at the inorganic form. Inorganic arsenic means the atom exists as a salt bound to a cation. It's similar to the naturally occurring arsenic found in geological coal deposits.
Okay, so it's a salt.
Yes. And when a person ingests this inorganic salt, it dissociates in the highly acidic environment of the stomach. It becomes free, unbound arsenic, and free inorganic arsenic is one of the most highly toxic substances we ever encounter.
Which creates a terrifying medico-legal dilemma. Because the standard routine laboratory methods used to detect arsenic in postmortem materials simply look for the presence of the element. They do not differentiate between the harmless organic arsenic left over from that oyster dinner and the lethal inorganic arsenic from a deliberately poisoned drink.
Which means the mere detection of arsenic on a standard screen is legally and clinically meaningless in isolation.
Totally meaningless.
Yes. If a pathologist goes to court and tries to diagnose fatal arsenic poisoning based solely on a positive elemental screen without any corroborating clinical history or pathological findings,
They're going to get destroyed on cross-examination.
a competent defense attorney will dismantle that testimony in minutes. You must know the limitations of your testing equipment. You have to tie the laboratory finding to the mechanism of the disease.
And the scale of this issue goes way beyond isolated homicides. The epidemiological reality of arsenic exposure today is staggering. We're looking at massive environmental contamination. Current estimates suggest over 13 million Americans, primarily those relying on unregulated private well water, are exposed to potentially toxic levels of free inorganic arsenic daily.
It's a huge issue.
And if we look globally, the entire aquifer of the Indian subcontinent is deeply contaminated.
That specific contamination of the Indian subcontinent's aquifer is actually one of the largest public health crises in modern history. It also creates a very specific clinical presentation we see today: herbal remedies.
Oh, because of the water used to grow them.
Exactly. Because many traditional medicines are derived from plants that utilize that contaminated water, the resulting herbal products can be tainted with dangerous levels of inorganic arsenic. But we have to look at the physiology here. Exposure does not automatically equal clinical illness.
Right, the body fights back.
It does. The human liver has a built-in protective mechanism. It can rapidly detoxify free arsenic by methylating it. This makes it water-soluble so the kidneys can excrete it safely.
But that metabolic safety valve has a threshold.
It certainly does. If a person ingests a massive acute dose, or if they have sustained high-level chronic exposure from their drinking water over years, the liver's metabolic capacity is completely overwhelmed. The free arsenic spills over into the systemic circulation, and the toxic cascade begins.
Let's break down what that cascade actually looks like, starting with acute poisoning. Before we even get to the internal organs, there is a distinct sensory clue at the scene or in the autopsy suite.
The odor.
Yes, the classic garlic-like odor. You might smell it on a living patient's breath, or a pathologist might detect it emanating from the tissues during examination.
It is a subtle but historically consistent finding. But the mechanics of acute poisoning, which we generally define as the administration of 1 gram or more of inorganic arsenic, are brutal. The gastrointestinal symptoms completely dominate the clinical picture. The patient experiences severe bloody vomiting and a copious, relentless diarrhea that resembles cholera. The mechanism of death here is not some mysterious, silent cellular shutdown. It is mechanical, catastrophic fluid loss.
The diarrhea is so profound that the vascular system basically empties out. The patient loses massive intravascular volume, dropping them into hypovolemic shock, which ultimately leads to cardiorespiratory failure.
And that timeline dictates exactly what the pathologist will find. If the victim dies incredibly quickly, say within an hour or two from massive cardiovascular collapse, the autopsy might reveal absolutely zero gross abnormalities.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. The inflammatory response simply hasn't had time to manifest. But if a few hours pass before death occurs, the upper gastrointestinal tract tells the story. The esophagus becomes intensely red and inflamed, and the bowel develops what pathologists classically describe as a red velvet appearance.
That red velvet descriptor is so vivid. The inflammation causes the mucosa of the stomach and intestines to become hyperemic, engorged with blood, giving it that plush, dark, hemorrhagic look.
It's very distinctive.
But there is another clue, a cardiac finding that happens in these delayed acute cases. You find bleeding in the muscle lining the inner surface of the left side of the heart, the left ventricular subendocardium. Now, following our rule of mechanism defining interpretation, we have to ask, is the arsenic directly destroying the heart muscle?
That is the essential distinction the forensic clinician must make, and the answer is no. The arsenic is not directly attacking the myocardium. This left ventricular subendocardial hemorrhage is a secondary mechanical injury.
Okay, so how does that work?
Think about what is happening physiologically. The patient is in profound hypovolemic shock from the bloody diarrhea. Their blood pressure has plummeted. The heart is beating frantically to compensate, but there isn't enough blood volume to maintain pressure in the coronary arteries.
So the heart is starving itself.
Precisely. The innermost layer of the heart muscle, the subendocardium, is the last tissue layer to receive oxygenated blood. So, when pressure drops systemically, it is the first tissue to starve. It becomes ischemic and bleeds. It is a vital post-mortem clear, but it points to the shock, not a direct toxic cardiac hit.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Chronic arsenic poisoning is a completely different beast. Acute poisoning is a violent, rapid shock to the system. Chronic poisoning is insidious.
It hides in plain sight.
It does. It masquerades as everyday ailments. It frequently gets misdiagnosed as routine gastroenteritis, or a patient might complain to their doctor about vague arm and leg pain, which is actually an arsenic-induced peripheral neuropathy.
Without a high index of suspicion, a general practitioner will miss it entirely. But there are visual dermatological anchors you must train yourself to recognize. In chronic poisoning, the skin undergoes distinct changes. It becomes overly dry and you see hyperpigmentation.
A darkening of the skin.
Right. A darkening that specifically accumulates within the natural creases and lines of the forehead and the neck. You might also see a raindrop pattern of pigmentation on the torso.
The clinical picture also includes diffuse hair loss and edema or swelling in the lower legs. Internally, the damage is microscopic but cumulative. The liver starts storing excessive fat, specifically accumulating around the edges of the liver lobules. The kidneys and heart sustain long-term damage that requires histological examination to prove. But one of the most fascinating physical timelines is found on the patient's hands. Mies lines.
Mies lines are remarkable. They are single, transverse white bands that stretch horizontally across the fingernails. They aren't just a symptom, they're a chronological record.
Like tree rings.
Very much like that. A Mies line represents a specific period where a surge of arsenic in the system disrupted the growth of the nail matrix. Because human fingernails grow at a relatively predictable constant rate, measuring the distance of that white line from the nail bed can give an investigator a rough but highly useful timeline of exactly when a significant toxic exposure occurred.
Because diagnosing this chronic state is so slippery, the medical community relies on a specific scoring system. The CASIDS, or Chronic Arsenic Intoxication Diagnostic Score. Simple blood or urine tests might completely miss a chronic low-level exposure because the arsenic has already left the bloodstream and settled deep into the tissues.
Which is why the CASIDS framework is so crucial. An essential criterion of the scoring system is the measurement of the patient's bone arsenic load.
Bone load, so it gets into the skeleton.
Yes. Over long periods, arsenic mimics calcium just enough to be deposited into the skeletal matrix. By measuring that bone load and combining it with a comprehensive systemic assessment of the skin, the liver, and the peripheral nerves, clinicians can piece together a diagnosis that a simple blood draw would miss entirely.
Before we close the book on arsenic, we have to connect it to a very modern danger for children. We all know the risk of lead paint in peeling Victorian-era homes. But the historical reality is that arsenic pigments, specifically a vibrant green pigment, were frequently mixed right alongside lead in those old paints.
Right, the Paris green.
Exactly. So if a toddler is picking at peeling paint in a historic home, they aren't just facing lead toxicity. They're facing a dual threat of chronic arsenic exposure. The historical context of manufacturing directly informs the modern clinical presentation.
That intersection of history, environment, and pathology is the absolute essence of forensic toxicology.
Okay, let's transition from a deceptive heavy metal to what is undeniably a ubiquitous environmental threat. Carbon monoxide. It is often referred to as the disease with 1,000 faces.
Carbon monoxide, or CO, remains a massive global public health issue. Its foundational physiology was described over a century ago by J.S. Haldane, yet it continues to claim lives because of its physical properties. It is a colorless, odorless, and completely non-irritant gas.
Meaning you wouldn't even know you're breathing it.
Exactly. If you walk into a room filled with it, you won't cough, your eyes won't water, you won't know it's there until you lose consciousness.
Yep.
It is the byproduct of incomplete combustion, produced whenever organic matter, like hydrocarbons, is burned in an environment that lacks enough oxygen to convert it fully into carbon dioxide.
So we are talking about car exhausts, petrol-powered generators, poorly ventilated domestic boilers, and charcoal barbecues. The danger threshold is remarkably low. Ambient air concentrations of more than 100 parts per million are enough to endanger human health. If we look at the UK statistics to ground this, between 1995 and 2018, there were nearly 700 unintentional CO deaths, predominantly male. But the fascinating part of that data is the massive drop over time.
Right.
From 6-8 deaths in 1995 down to just 3 in 2017.
That reduction is a profound triumph of engineering and regulatory intervention. Specifically, the mandatory introduction of catalytic converters in all modern automobile exhaust systems. We will touch on how that changed scene investigation shortly. But despite the drop in acute fatalities, low-grade, non-fatal carbon monoxide exposure remains vastly underdiagnosed. And to understand why it's so easily missed, we have to look closely at the physiology of asphyxiation. Carbon monoxide doesn't just push oxygen out of the room, it actively sabotages the body's internal transport mechanics.
Let's use an analogy here. Imagine the hemoglobin in your red blood cells as a fleet of delivery trucks. Their only job is to pick up boxes of oxygen from the lungs and drive them to the tissues, the brain, the heart, the muscles. Carbon monoxide doesn't just take up space in the truck. It fundamentally hijacks the vehicle.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. Carbon monoxide binds to the exact same receptor sites on the hemoglobin molecule as oxygen, forming a compound called carboxyhemoglobin, or COHB. But here is the biochemical advantage. Hemoglobin's binding affinity for carbon monoxide is roughly 250 times greater than its affinity for oxygen.
250 times?
Yes. If a hemoglobin molecule is presented with both gases, it will fiercely grab the carbon monoxide and completely ignore the oxygen.
But the hijacking gets worse. It's not just about taking up the seats in the truck. Carbon monoxide actually changes the physical shape of the hemoglobin molecule, causing what we call the leftward shift.
The oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve is a physiological principle that dictates how easily hemoglobin lets go of oxygen once it reaches the tissues. When carbon monoxide binds to even 1 or 2 slots on a 4-slot hemoglobin molecule, it alters the structural conformation of the entire protein.
It changes the shape.
It changes the shape. This change causes the remaining oxygen molecules bound to that specific hemoglobin to be held much, much tighter. This is the shift to the left.
So mapping that back to our delivery truck, the truck picks up whatever oxygen it can, it drives to the brain. But because of the carbon monoxide, the doors are jammed shut. The blood has oxygen, but it stubbornly refuses to deliver it to the starving tissues.
Precisely. The result is profound cellular hypoxia. The tissues are suffocating while swimming in a bloodstream that is holding the oxygen hostage. And as the heart muscle starves, cardiac output drops, creating a vicious cycle of worsening hypoxia that rapidly leads to death.
But that is just the acute transport issue. There is a secondary mechanism at play with chronic exposure that explains why survivors often suffer long-term neurological damage.
Yes, the hypoxia alone doesn't explain the full clinical picture. Carbon monoxide doesn't solely restrict itself to hemoglobin. With high level or sustained exposure, it begins leaving the bloodstream and entering the cells directly. It binds to myoglobin in the muscle tissue, impairing muscle function. But most devastatingly, it binds to the cytochromes within the mitochondria, specifically cytochrome A3 in the P450 system.
It attacks the cell's internal energy factory.
Exactly. By binding to these cellular enzymes, carbon monoxide initiates a complex cascade of intercellular events that culminates in massive oxidative stress. It generates reactive oxygen species that physically damage the brain tissue on a fundamental level. This mechanism explains why survivors of CO poisoning can develop profound psychiatric and neurological sequelae: memory loss, personality changes, Parkinsonism, days, months, or even years after the gas is completely gone from their blood.
Which perfectly illustrates why it's called the disease with 1,000 faces. The clinical presentation is a minefield. If you look at older medical textbooks, they always list a classic triad for acute CO intoxication: cherry red lips, cyanosis, and retinal hemorrhages.
Ah, the classic triad.
Right. But the reality check for a forensic pathologist or ER doctor is stark. That classic triad is incredibly rare in living patients.
Waiting to see a cherry red patient before suspecting CO poisoning is a dangerous forensic myth. In reality, the presentation is insidious. A patient walks into a clinic complaining of general malaise, a throbbing headache, dizziness, nausea, maybe some poor concentration.
They sound like they have the flu.
They look and feel exactly like they have a standard winter viral illness. And tragically, they're often misdiagnosed with the flu, given some fluids, and sent right back to the very house that is actively poisoning them.
If the exposure continues, that flu-like state escalates to chest pain, palpitations, severe confusion, myocardial ischemia, loss of consciousness, and death. So how does a clinician catch it before it's too late? There is a very specific mnemonic anchor used for environmental exposure investigations, CH2OPD2.
Systematic inquiry is your only defense against missing this diagnosis. CH2OPD2 forces the clinician to ask the right questions. C is for community. Is there a localized environmental issue? Are the neighbors also feeling sick?
Right.
The first H is home. Have the gas appliances been serviced recently? Is the boiler venting properly? The second H is hobbies. Is the patient using chemical paint strippers in a closed room or running a petrol engine in a garage?
Okay, what about the O?
O is for occupation. Are they a forklift driver, a mechanic, a firefighter? P is personal. Is there a possibility of intentional self-harm? And then the two Ds are diet and drugs. While diet is less relevant for CO, it's a standard part of a broad toxicology screen, and drugs are standard for ruling out other causes of altered mental status. The key is digging into the home, hobbies, and occupation. That is where the carbon monoxide is hiding.
Let's talk about the actual diagnosis, because there are two massive medico-legal pitfalls waiting for junior doctors here. The first is what we can call the venous versus arterial paradox. To confirm CO poisoning, you need to measure venous carboxyhemoglobin levels. A level above 10% confirms the diagnosis, keeping in mind that heavy smokers might sit anywhere from 2% to 10% naturally.
Yes, smokers have a higher baseline.
But when a patient comes into the ER struggling to breathe, the instinct isn't a venous draw. It's an arterial blood gas, an ABG.
And relying on an ABG in a carbon monoxide case is a catastrophic trap. Let's walk through that ER scenario. A patient is confused, nauseous, and tachypneic, breathing fast. The junior doctor draws an arterial blood gas. When the results come back, the doctor looks at the partial pressure of oxygen, the PO2, and sees that it is completely normal. They might erroneously conclude that the patient's oxygenation is fine and rule out asphyxiation.
How can the PO2 be normal if the patient is suffocating at the cellular level?
Because the partial pressure of oxygen only measures the oxygen that is dissolved freely in the blood plasma. It does not measure the oxygen bound to the hemoglobin. The patient's lungs are working perfectly fine. They are pulling oxygen from the room air and dissolving it into the plasma. The PO2 looks great, but if the doctor looks closer at the ABG, they will see a severely decreased oxygen saturation because the hemoglobin seats are all taken by carbon monoxide. Furthermore, they will see a profound metabolic acidosis. Because the cells are starving for oxygen, they switch to anaerobic metabolism, which produces lactic acid, dropping the blood pH. You have to look at the whole clinical picture, not just the PO2.
And the second major pitfall is the half-life trap.
Carboxyhemoglobin is not a permanent fixture. It has half-life. The moment you remove the victim from the toxic environment and expose them to fresh ambient air, those COHB levels begin to drop. If paramedics arrive and administer high-flow 100% oxygen, that half-life decreases dramatically, rapidly clearing the carbon monoxide from the blood.
Which means by the time blood is drawn in the emergency department, or by the time a forensic pathologist performs an autopsy days later, the COHB level might have plummeted back to a completely normal value.
Exactly. A normal postmortem or ER carboxyhemoglobin level does not rule out lethal carbon monoxide poisoning if significant time has passed since the victim was removed from the source. The toxin may have cleared the blood, but the hypoxic and oxidative damage to the brain and heart was already done.
Let's apply this to scene investigation and suicide trends, because the forensic landscape has completely shifted over the decades. In the 1950s, the classic method for suicide in the UK was inhaling coal gas from an unlit oven.
But that method became obsolete in the 1960s when the national infrastructure transitioned from toxic coal gas to natural gas, which is mostly methane and does not contain carbon monoxide.
So the trend moved to the garage, running a hose from a car's tailpipe into the sealed cabin. But then, as we mentioned earlier, engineering intervened again.
The catalytic converter changed everything. A modern, properly functioning catalytic converter eliminates over 99% of the carbon monoxide produced by the combustion engine. While it is still technically possible to achieve lethal levels, if a modern car is left running for an extended period in a highly sealed, very small garage, it is incredibly difficult.
Which brings us to the modern forensic reality. Today, the most frequent scenario for both accidental CO poisonings and suicides is the indoor use of a charcoal barbecue.
A lit charcoal grill produces massive, concentrated volumes of carbon monoxide. If someone brings a grill into a tent to keep warm while camping, or lights one in a closed apartment, it creates a rapidly lethal environment. For the forensic investigator, the scene itself is the primary diagnostic tool for determining the manner of death.
Looking for intent.
Right. If it's an intended suicide, the investigator will usually find that windows, door frames, and air vents have been meticulously taped or sealed off to intentionally trap the gas. If those seals are absent, the medical examiner faces a very difficult task differentiating between a tragic accident, someone just trying to heat their home during a power outage, and an intentional act.
We are moving from a gas that sabotages transport to a poison that attacks the destination. Section 3. Cyanide, the cellular suffocator. Carbon monoxide prevents the delivery truck from dropping off the oxygen. Cyanide operates completely differently.
Cyanide is a fascinating molecule because it allows the oxygen transport system to work perfectly. The blood is fully oxygenated. The hemoglobin drops the oxygen off at the tissues exactly as it should. The cell is literally bathed in oxygen. But cyanide penetrates the cell membrane, enters the mitochondria, and irreversibly binds to a specific vital enzyme, cytochrome C oxidase.
Cytochrome C oxidase. We briefly mentioned the cytochrome system with carbon monoxide's secondary effects, but for cyanide, this is the primary catastrophic target.
It is the terminal enzyme in the electron transport chain. It is the very last step in the process of cellular respiration. By inhibiting cytochrome 5 oxidase, cyanide completely halts the cell's ability to utilize oxygen to make ATP, the energy currency of the cell.
So the delivery trucks dropped off the oxygen, but the factory is closed.
Think of it exactly like a factory assembly line. The raw materials, the oxygen, are piling up at the door, but the final machine on the line has been permanently shut down. The factory grinds to a halt. Because the heart and the brain are the most metabolically demanding organs, they cannot survive without ATP. This complete cellular energy failure leads to systemic collapse and cardiac arrest within minutes.
We often associate cyanide with spy movies and suicide pills, but the real-world sources of exposure are much more common. The most frequent forensic encounter today actually happens in building fires.
Yes, the toxicology of smoke inhalation has completely changed. In modern structure fires, carbon monoxide is no longer the only toxic threat. Contemporary building materials are filled with synthetic fabrics, polyurethanes, and complex plastics. When these modern materials burn, they liberate high volumes of cyanide gas.
So it's a dual threat.
Absolutely. If a victim is pulled unconscious from a burning building today, emergency physicians and forensic pathologists must operate under the assumption that they are dealing with combined carbon monoxide and cyanide toxicity.
There is also an iatrogenic source, a medically induced exposure, that occurs in the intensive care unit involving a drug called sodium nitroprusside.
Sodium nitroprusside is an incredibly potent, fast-acting vasodilator used to rapidly lower dangerously high blood pressure in hypertensive emergencies. However, the chemical structure of the drug contains 5 cyanide groups. 5. If a patient is given high doses of this infusion for a prolonged period, the body's natural ability to metabolize and clear the liberated cyanide is overwhelmed. The drug essentially turns into a poison, leading to doctor-induced cyanide toxicity. It requires intense, continuous clinical monitoring.
Beyond acute scenarios, there's a massive dietary source of chronic cyanide exposure globally, particularly in tropical Africa, involving the cassava root.
Cassava is a dietary staple for millions of people. However, the raw root contains high levels of cyanogenic glycosides. To make it safe to eat, it requires rigorous processing, soaking, fermenting, and thorough cooking. If it is improperly prepared, it continuously releases low levels of cyanide into the body. This chronic low-level exposure doesn't cause immediate cardiac arrest, but over years it causes progressive, devastating damage to the nervous system, presenting clinically as profound weakness and eventually permanent paralysis.
And on a much smaller scale, we have to consider the baseline difference in smokers.
Tobacco smoke naturally contains small amounts of cyanide gas. If you test a non-smoker, their baseline blood cyanide concentration is practically negligible, usually less than 0.01 micromoles per liter. But simply being a daily smoker raises that baseline by a factor of 4. And in chronic, heavy smokers, their everyday, completely asymptomatic blood cyanide concentrations can be 10 times higher than a non-smoker's.
So that context is key for the pathologist.
This is a vital piece of context. If a forensic pathologist is trying to interpret a borderline post-mortem toxicology result, knowing whether the deceased smoked 2 packs a day is crucial to determining if the cyanide level is a cause of death or just a lifestyle artifact.
Let's bring this into the autopsy suite. When people think of cyanide poisoning, they immediately think of the classic hallmark, the smell of bitter almonds. You open the chest cavity of the deceased, and that distinctive scent hits the air.
It is a profound, immediate sensory clue for the pathologist. But there is a very dangerous biological reality check here. It is a forensic myth that everyone can smell it. Roughly 10% of the general human population carries a specific genetic trait that renders them completely unable to perceive the odor of cyanide. They are genetically blind to the scent of bitter almonds.
Think about what that means in a real-world scenario. A pathologist could be leaning over a victim who ingested a massive dose of cyanide, opening the stomach or the chest cavity, breathing in highly toxic volatile fumes, and they would have absolutely no idea they're in danger.
Which is precisely why strict safety protocols are enforced in modern autopsy suites. You rarely, if ever, perform an autopsy in complete isolation. Normal operating procedures dictate that multiple staff members, technicians, pathology assistants, other doctors are present in the room. Statistically, the odds are high that at least one person in that room does not have the genetic blind spot. They will be able to perceive the bitter almond odor and immediately raise the alarm, allowing the team to halt the autopsy, initiate heavy ventilation, and utilize safety equipment before the ambient exposure becomes critical.
We are shifting gears now, moving away from the suffocating gases and back to the heavy metals. Section 4, lead, the calcium imposter. We touched on lead briefly when we discussed the peeling paint in Victorian homes, but the modern exposure map is much broader than just old paint chips.
Old lead-based paint remains the primary hazard for toddlers, largely because, as it flakes off the walls, it breaks into a dust that gets on their hands. And interestingly, it has a surprisingly sweet taste, making it attractive to young children. But today, we see diverse exposure routes. We see entire communities poisoned by degraded, lead-contaminated water infrastructure or contaminated soil near old industrial sites. We see it in certain imported, unregulated consumer goods and toys. It is heavily associated with the use of some traditional Ayurvedic medicines, which sometimes intentionally incorporate heavy metals for purported therapeutic effects.
And what about adults?
In the adult population, the primary risk is occupational exposure. Workers in battery manufacturing plants, smelting operations, and certain types of construction and demolition.
So how does lead actually cause damage? What is the mechanism? If we map this to our physiological rules, lead acts as a biological imposter.
It is a truly remarkable, albeit devastating, trick of chemistry. Lead exerts its toxicity primarily because it is able to successfully substitute for calcium in fundamental cellular processes throughout the entire human body. Now, from a strictly chemical perspective, this is baffling. The electronic structure and the ionic radius of a lead ion do not bear any particular resemblance to a calcium ion, yet the body's complex transport systems and cellular receptors are somehow completely fooled.
And because the body's security system thinks it is dealing with calcium, a vital, necessary nutrient, it gives lead the VIP pass to enter places it absolutely should not be.
Exactly. It easily crosses the membranes of red blood cells, but most destructively, it easily crosses the blood-brain barrier. Once it enters the brain, it infiltrates the neuroglia cells. These are the critical support cells that maintain neural pathways, manage synaptic pruning, and support overall brain function. Because lead is occupying the spaces meant for calcium, it disrupts all the calcium-dependent processes that are crucial for neurological development.
Which explains the effects on kids.
This is the exact physiological explanation for the tragedy of childhood lead poisoning. It isn't just a temporary sickness, it chemically alters the hardware of the developing brain, resulting in permanent, irreversible learning disabilities, cognitive deficits, and severe behavioral disorders.
So what does this look like clinically, and how do we diagnose it? The physical symptoms can be maddeningly vague at first. Severe cramping abdominal pain, often historically called lead colic, along with headaches, anemia, and extreme irritability. In severe acute cases, the neurological damage rapidly progresses to seizures, coma, and death.
Radiologically, there is a very distinct sign in children. Because their bones are still actively growing, and because the body is treating the lead as if it were calcium, the lead is actively deposited heavily into the growing bone matrix. If you take an X-ray of a child's long bones, you'll see dense, bright white, radio-opaque bands at the metaphyses, the growth plates.
But the gold standard diagnostic anchor, the thing that absolutely confirms the diagnosis under a microscope, is a specific hematological finding: basophilic stippling.
Basophilic stippling is a beautiful, striking pathological finding. If you were to look at a standard blood smear from a healthy patient under a microscope, the red blood cells look like clear, smooth, pinkish discs. But lead actively inhibits the specific enzymes that are responsible for breaking down ribosomal RNA during the final maturation stages of a red blood cell. Because that breakdown process is blocked, remnants of destroyed DNA and RNA get left behind inside the cell.
So you can actually see the debris.
Yes. When a hematologist applies a stain to the blood slide, those remnants show up as distinct dark blue staining dots lining the inner margins of the red blood cells. That is basophilic stippling. When you see those blue dots, it is considered definitive diagnostic proof of severe lead poisoning.
And once it's diagnosed, the treatment relies on literally pulling the metal out of the system.
The primary metric is measuring the exact blood lead level. If it reaches a dangerous threshold, the patient undergoes chelation therapy. Clinicians administer specific chelating drugs that circulate in the bloodstream, chemically bind to the heavy lead ions, and form a secure complex that the kidneys can safely filter out and excrete in the urine.
We're entering our final category for today, Section 5, methanol, the delayed destroyer. We've examined toxins that kill in minutes, like cyanide, and those that maim over years, like lead. Methanol sits in a terrifying middle ground. It acts as a chemical Trojan horse.
Methanol is a simple industrial alcohol. You find it constantly in commercial products. Windscreen washer fluid, certain solvents, copy machine fluids, and historically, embalming fluid. It is famously known as wood alcohol, and was the deadly component in poorly distilled historical moonshine. While bad moonshine is less common today, methanol poisoning is still a regular occurrence because it is heavily used as a denaturant.
Right. Industrial ethanol, which is just standard drinking alcohol, is taxed heavily. To avoid those liquor taxes for industrial products, manufacturers add methanol to the ethanol to make it toxic and undrinkable. But occasionally, desperate people do drink it, or children accidentally ingest vividly colored household products containing it. And the mechanism of how it kills is where the delayed destroyer moniker originates.
If you drink methanol, the immediate effect is very similar to standard ethanol. It causes central nervous system depression. You appear intoxicated. But the methanol molecule itself isn't the primary killer. The true danger lies in the liver's metabolic process. The liver employs an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase to break down alcohols. When it goes to work on methanol, it breaks it down into two major, highly toxic metabolites, formic acid or formate and lactic acid.
This metabolic process creates a fascinating biphasic clinical course. The poisoning happens in two distinct delayed phases.
Phase 1 is the initial intoxication. The patient experiences that CNS depression. Headache, dizziness, nausea, lack of coordination. They seem severely drunk. If they consume a massive quantity, they might simply go into a coma and die from the depressive effects. But usually they survive this initial phase and the symptoms actually begin to subside.
And that is when the trap springs. Phase 2 hits, and it hits with a massive 10 to 30-hour delay.
Yes. The patient might go to sleep thinking they're just going to suffer a bad hangover, but while they sleep, their liver is quietly, efficiently churning out massive amounts of formic acid. As this formate accumulates in the bloodstream, the catastrophic secondary symptoms strike. The absolute hallmark of methanol poisoning is profound visual disturbance. Patients describe seeing a snowstorm which rapidly progresses to complete, irreversible blindness.
Well, that is terrifying.
It is. Simultaneously, the massive buildup of both formic and lactic acid causes a severe metabolic acidosis, violently dropping the pH of the blood. If left unchecked, this rapidly progresses to multi-organ failure and death.
If we map this back to our physiological rules, we can actually link methanol right back to our discussion on cyanide. Because why is formic acid so toxic to the eyes and the organs?
It is a brilliant, terrifying physiological connection. Formic acid is devastating precisely because it utilizes the exact same mechanism as cyanide. Formate actively inhibits mitochondrial cytochrome site oxidase. It blocks cellular respiration. It causes profound hypoxia at the cellular level. And for anatomical and metabolic reasons, the optic nerve is exquisitely sensitive to this specific enzyme blockade, which is why irreversible blindness is the classic defining symptom.
It all comes back to the mechanism. So how does a doctor treat a patient whose liver is actively turning a chemical into cyanide-like formate? The medical management is a brilliant piece of physiological hacking.
It is essentially a biochemical distraction technique. We know that the liver enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase, is what creates the deadly formate. But we also know that this enzyme strongly prefers standard ethanol over methanol. Its binding affinity for ethanol is much higher. So if a patient presents with methanol poisoning, the medical team will literally administer an intravenous drip of standard ethanol or a specific pharmaceutical inhibitor called fombazole.
You flood the system with the safe alcohol to keep the enzyme busy.
Exactly. We call it competitive inhibition. The alcohol dehydrogenase enzymes get so busy processing the overwhelming amount of ethanol that they completely ignore the methanol. This brilliantly halts the toxic cascade, preventing any new formic acid from being created. But the patient still has raw methanol and whatever formate was already created circulating in their blood. So the next step is aggressive hemodialysis, hooking the patient up to an artificial kidney machine to physically filter the methanol and the formate out of the bloodstream. Finally, the team will aggressively push intravenous sodium bicarbonate to neutralize the severe metabolic acidosis and correct the blood's pH. It is an absolute race against the clock to save the patient's life and their sight.
As we synthesize everything we've covered today, stepping back from Simpson's Chapter 26, the overarching lesson is crystal clear. You cannot effectively practice forensic medicine by just memorizing a list of symptoms. Rare toxins demand a deep foundational understanding of human physiology. Whether we are talking about carbon monoxide silently shifting the oxygen dissociation curve to the left, or lead cunningly mimicking calcium to breach the blood-brain barrier, or cyanide and methanol both launching targeted metabolic attacks on cytochrome oxidase, the mechanism is the master key. It is the only way to accurately interpret the scene, the autopsy findings, and the laboratory results.
That deep understanding is the dividing line between a technician who just reads a lab value and a true forensic clinician who can tell the story of the death. You must be able to trace the pathology from the subcellular enzyme blockade all the way up to the macroscopic presentation on the autopsy table, and finally, articulate that clearly in a medico-legal report.
As we wrap up this finale, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to consider as you close the textbook on Season 10.
Consider this reality. The chapter on miscellaneous poisons is never truly finished. It merely changes its chemical signature to match the era. Think about how the transition from coal gas to modern catalytic converters changed the entire epidemiology of carbon monoxide poisoning. What is coming next? As our modern environment evolves, as we surround ourselves with entirely new synthetic building plastics, as we massively scale up advanced lithium-ion battery manufacturing, and as we engineer novel industrial nanomaterials, we are inevitably creating entirely new toxicological profiles.
The poisons of the future.
Yes, the forensic pathologists of tomorrow will be facing miscellaneous poisons that we haven't even named yet. The principles of mechanism and interpretation we've discussed today will be their only guide in the dark.
The science never stops evolving. Okay, before we officially sign off, I want to play a quick game. It's time for our learning reinforcement. Let's see how well those mechanisms stuck with you. I am going to give you 6 single best answer clinical prompts based entirely on what we've covered today. I'll read the scenario, take a brief second, and then our expert will reveal the solution and the core concept you need to review if you missed it. Ready? Let's go. Question 1. A post-mortem toxicology screen detects high levels of arsenic. However, standard testing cannot differentiate between the highly toxic inorganic form and the harmless organic form. Biologically, why is the organic form considered harmless? Take a second.
The answer is because the arsenic atom is bound to a complex carbon-based molecule, making it biologically inert. It passes through the body without exerting toxic effects. The fundamental difference is the unbound, salt-based nature of the inorganic form.
Question 2. During the autopsy of a patient who died several hours after acute arsenic ingestion, you note left ventricular subendocardial hemorrhage. What is the physiological mechanism causing this specific cardiac finding? Have a think.
The answer is hypovolemic shock. It is not a direct toxic attack on the heart. The profound fluid loss from bloody diarrhea causes a sudden collapse in blood pressure, leading to ischemia and bleeding in the most vulnerable innermost layer of the heart muscle.
Question 3. A patient is pulled from an enclosed garage with a running vehicle and presents with confusion and nausea. The junior doctor draws an arterial blood gas. What specific ABG value is likely to appear deceptively normal, masking the severity of the carbon monoxide poisoning?
Got it. The answer is the partial pressure of oxygen, or the PO2. This value only measures the oxygen dissolved in the blood plasma, not the oxygen blocked from binding to the carbon monoxide hijacked hemoglobin.
Question 4. Victims pulled from modern structure fires often suffer from combined carbon monoxide and cyanide toxicity. What specific terminal cellular enzyme is irreversibly inhibited by cyanide gas? Take a moment.
The answer is cytochrome oxidase. By blocking this enzyme in the mitochondria, cyanide completely halts cellular respiration, causing rapid cellular starvation and cardiac arrest despite the presence of oxygen.
Question 5. You are examining the blood smear of a child presenting with severe cognitive deficits and abdominal colic. You observe dark, blue-staining remnants of destroyed RNA lining the margins of the red blood cells. What is this diagnostic finding called, and what metal does it indicate?
The answer is basophilic stippling. This is the hallmark hematological finding for severe lead poisoning, demonstrating its disruption of normal cellular maturation.
Question 6. A patient presents to the emergency department with profound visual disturbances and severe metabolic acidosis after consuming illicitly distilled liquor. Why does the medical team immediately administer an intravenous drip of standard ethanol? Think back to the liver.
The answer is competitive inhibition. The ethanol occupies the liver enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, keeping it busy and preventing it from breaking the methanol down into its blindness-causing legal metabolite formic acid.
And that is a wrap. You have officially made it through the Miscellaneous Poisons, and you have conquered Season 10. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive. Your dedication to mastering the mechanisms behind the medicine is exactly why we produce this series. We strongly encourage you, as always, to open up Simpson's Forensic Medicine, review the chapters we've discussed, and keep exploring the complex, ever-evolving world of pathology. Until next time, stay curious.